Why is work so terrible? Well, lots of reasons. But today I want to focus on one thing in particular, something that I think doesn't really get enough attention in conversations about why work is so bad. I want to talk about de-skilling. And I think the best way to start is with a thought experiment. Let's say there was a blizzard last night, and now you have to shovel the sidewalk. So you have a shovel and warm clothes and all morning with no other plans. You're all ready to go, getting ready to head outside, when your roommate comes up to you and says, "Wait, I've been conducting a scientific study of the most efficient way to shovel snow. If you agree to do everything I tell you, how to hold the shovel, how much snow to scoop at a particular time, when to take breaks, how to move your arms and your legs and your back, you can have it done in two-thirds the amount of time it would usually take." So you have two options. One, you can tell your roommate, "Thanks for the offer, but I'd rather do it my own way." Or two, you can tell your roommate, "You know what? Sure, let's try it." If you choose option two, then you spend the next hour or so doing every single thing your roommate says exactly the way you're told. How to hold the shovel, how to bend your elbows, your knees, your back, how much snow to shovel each time, when to take breaks and for how long, where to start and what pattern to go around the sidewalk in, everything. Personally, I would choose option one. But the main advantage of option two is that it really is more efficient. You do finish the shoveling more quickly, so I don't think it would be that weird to give up control over how the work is done if it means getting back inside more quickly. But now let's take the thought experiment a little bit further. Let's say it's your job to shovel snow out of people's sidewalks. You do it 8 hours a day for an hourly wage. So let's run it again. Option one, you shovel the way you want to and the way that makes sense to you. Or option two, your roommate, now let's say your boss, is dictating your every move. Just like before, in this scenario, you do shovel more snow in less time, but you work the same hours and you get paid the same wage as you would in option one. Now, in this scenario, I think it would be very strange to go with the option that involves someone following you around, constantly giving you directions that you have to follow. It would be miserable, and you wouldn't even benefit. This is called scientific management. Someone else, your boss, has determined the most efficient way for the work to be done, right down to the specific movements a worker should make, and designs your job accordingly. He doesn't say, "Shovel the sidewalk." He says, "Hold the shovel like this, shovel this much snow, go this direction," and so on. When this happens to work, the work is de-skilled. De-skilling is what happens when your expertise, your knowledge, and your skill are made irrelevant to the job. It's usually talked about in the context of jobs that a long time ago required a worker with lots of training, but don't anymore. But I like the snow shoveling example, even if shoveling snow isn't traditionally considered skilled labor. So let's do another example. Let's say you work in a smartphone factory. Do you know how to make a smartphone? Probably not, but it wouldn't matter if you did. Before they hired you, no one asked if you knew how to make a smartphone, because that's not what they hired you for. They hired you to stand at an assembly line and do one motion over and over all day. The planning, the knowledge, the expertise, all of that belongs to management. Your job is to do what they tell you in exactly the way they tell you to do it. Because they have already figured out the most efficient way for smartphones to be made, and it doesn't require someone with specialized skills. It requires someone to work at an assembly line. That's scientific management, and your job is de-skilled. "But Duncan," you might say, "I don't know anyone who works in a factory. What does this have to do with me?" Well, fair point. I also don't know anyone who works in a factory. But if you look at the way a lot of industries operate here in the US today in 2023, it does start to become clear that de-skilling is not just something that happened a long time ago or somewhere far away. So let's talk about call centers. Have you ever been on the phone with a customer service department? Maybe there was a weird charge on your phone bill or you wanted to cancel a subscription. If you have, you might have had the very frustrating experience of talking to someone who was following a script. Maybe there were lots of awkward pauses. Maybe there were responses that didn't really answer your questions, and just none of the organic back and forth that a normal conversation kind of naturally has. The thing is, this is kind of new. As recently as a few decades ago, call centers tended to be smaller, they tended to serve a small geographic area, and they relied on the expertise of individual workers who'd been doing the job with the same company for years. One Verizon call center rep, named Pat, used to work in a facility where she was seated with three other workers, all together in what they called a quad, answering questions as they came up. Their individual expertise mattered, and they also sometimes worked as a team. Here's how she described it. We always joked that between the four of us, we made one good rep. If I had a question, I would turn to the rep on my left or right and ask, has this come up before? What do you think of this? So, if you called Pat, you'd get to have an actual conversation with a real person who was using her knowledge and experience to get you the answers you needed. And on top of that, she could turn and ask her colleagues questions if there were things that she couldn't answer herself. Now consider a different worker, Martha, who worked at a Verizon call center more recently. Martha worked at a mega call center, a much larger facility that is now the norm, and there are some pretty important differences between her experience and Pat's. First, Martha worked on her own, so there was no turning to compare notes with her colleagues nearby if a caller asked a difficult question. But also, the kinds of questions Martha was likely to get were streamlined. She would only get calls from general residential users, that is, just regular people calling about their phone service, while the other kinds of calls from larger companies who might have more complicated questions were routed somewhere else. The advantage of routing general residential users to Martha and other workers like Martha was that Verizon could generate a script to cover all the most common questions, which they did. That minimized the amount of time Martha spent on each call, so she could take more calls each day. It also made any expertise she had totally irrelevant. You can imagine what this does to the work. If you have to follow a script, it doesn't matter if you're in your first week on the job or your 20th year. Experience and specialized knowledge just aren't relevant. To be clear, I don't actually know the details of how Verizon creates or updates its mega call center scripts, and really the details aren't actually important here. What's important is that de-skilling is not just a historical relic or something that happens far away. It's alive and well in workplaces in the US today. So why do employers tend toward this kind of thing? In some ways, it doesn't really make sense. It makes work worse. You can imagine the drudgery of this kind of work, being told exactly what to do day in and day out, 40 hours a week or more for decades. Also, this isn't really the point, but it's worth mentioning that it can make things worse for people outside the workplace too. If you've been on a call with a customer service rep following a script, you know from experience that it would be much easier and just a better experience altogether if they would just talk to you like a person. So why? The short answer is money, but that's a little too easy. It's worth dissecting this a little bit. De-skilling work means making the process more efficient. Remember the snow shoveling example. If your boss follows you around and tells you exactly what to do all day, you might be miserable, but more shoveling does get done. And if you get paid the same amount anyway, all that extra shoveling means more profit for your boss. De-skilling also means that labor itself is cheaper. If the job has been designed to make a worker's expertise, creativity, and skill irrelevant, then the pool of people who can do the job is much larger, meaning wages can be kept low. Imagine you're doing an interview for a call center job with Verizon. In a different world, you might get questions like, how are your people skills? Can you be patient and thoughtful when speaking with a frustrated customer? Are you creative and analytical enough to solve a variety of problems in the moment? And maybe people did get asked those questions in interviews in the 80s. But today, I bet you might get questions like, can you read a script? Can you stick to it? Will you do what we tell you to do in exactly the way we tell you to do it? It's easier for Verizon to find people who can read a script than to find people who are diplomatic and creative and have advanced interpersonal skills. So efficiency and cheaper labor are major reasons for de-skilling. But I also want to talk about another thing that I think is going on here, and it's a little more nebulous, but it's worth thinking about. De-skilling is also about control. In a workplace, who has control over the work? In one way, management has control over hours, working conditions, who does what and for how much. Whoever owns the operation gets to make the rules. But in another way, workers have control. They're the ones actually, doing the work. They move their hands or use their words or come up with solutions to problems, all as part of the process of doing their jobs. In other words, the goods and services happen because of the things that the workers do. So, are both of these roles necessary? Well, not really, right? I mean, hours, working conditions, deciding who does what, all of those things are important, but there isn't really a reason it has to be done by management. Management is unnecessary to the process of the making of the things. But by changing work to de-skill it, they take part of that process for themselves. Let's say there are two parts to work, the planning and the doing. So if you're shoveling snow, you're planning how you're going to do it, and you're the one doing it. But if you work in a mega call center, you're the one doing the work, but someone else, the people writing the script, are the ones deciding how it's going to happen. The planning and the doing are split in two, and one of them now belongs to management. Again, increased efficiency and lower labor costs are enough to explain why this happens, but I think that this intangible aspect of control over the labor process itself is an important part of what's going on. Also, as long as I'm saying things I technically can't prove, a note on splitting the labor process in this way. My hot take is that this is unnatural. My hot take is that this is unnatural. It's contrary to our nature and the nature of work. I wouldn't want to let my roommate follow me around giving me instructions while I shovel snow because it would be tedious and annoying, but also because it just feels wrong in some way I can't really articulate. And I'm going to have to rely on your good faith reception of this point because it's not the kind of thing that can be proven. When management mangles the labor process so that they have a monopoly on the planning part, they take control over a crucial portion of the work. To be clear, I'm not talking about a shift manager at Starbucks who makes $2 an hour more than a barista. I've never worked at a Starbucks, but probably everyone who works at a particular store plays an important role in making it run, including low-level managers. I also want to make it clear that I know that different industries operate differently. So if you're doing a construction project, different workers do different things. I'm not saying there's something wrong with there being a difference between what an architect does and what a crane operator does. Really, what I'm talking about here are owners, the people who play no role in the work itself. If they can artificially split the labor process in two and keep the planning part to themselves, or to a circle of high-level decision-making managers, then they take control of part of that production process and make themselves necessary to it. They would never admit it, but I think owners are always a little bit afraid because on some level they know that they are unnecessary to that process. Eugene Debs said, "We can run the mills without them, but they cannot run them without us." And I think that's what a lot of this comes down to. Efficiency, yes, and cheap labor, yes, definitely, but also a need for more control, a need that I think comes from fear. But Duncan, you might say, my heart goes out to those call center workers, but I work in a field where this isn't really on the table. It just wouldn't be possible to separate the planning from the doing in my job. Well, this might be true, but it also might be less true than you imagine. Some fields that theoretically shouldn't be able to be de-skilled are anyway. And that brings me to my final example, teachers. By any metric, teaching is a skilled profession. It requires specialized training, and like any job that involves working with people, it requires pretty advanced interpersonal skills, the ability to think on one's feet, adaptability, diplomacy, tact, to say nothing of mastery of a subject. But at public schools in the US, what teaching looks like has changed just over the last few decades. If you ask a public school teacher what their job looks like, It probably won't take long before they start telling you about losing control over what they do in the classroom. The way they teach is increasingly being dictated by administrators, up to and including being required to use actual scripts in some cases. On top of that, training requirements are being weakened, so the labor pool stays large, which is successfully keeping wages low. It doesn't matter that teaching is theoretically a profession that should be safe from de-skilling. It's happening in a different way than it's happening to assembly line workers or call center workers, but it is still happening. Maybe your job is safe from de-skilling. Maybe it's obvious that the planning and the doing can't be separated for someone with your job. And maybe next week you'll hear about a new initiative your boss is implementing to streamline or standardize some part of your job. Hopefully not, but I think it's good to be prepared. And if you want to fight de-skilling in your workplace, there's really only one good way. A union is the way to fight de-skilling. The Verizon workers I mentioned earlier have a union, and the contract they negotiated with management addresses some major issues. Most pertinently, workers no longer have to follow a script. They still have a list of points they're supposed to hit over the course of a call, but they use their own judgment and expertise, their own skill, to decide how each call is going to go. So, if you have a union, get involved with it. Find out who your steward is and talk to them. Ask to see your contract. Talk to your coworkers about pushing back on the de-skilling trends that might be going on in your workplace. And then, when it's time to negotiate the next contract, make sure those aspects of your job are on the bargaining table. But I know that it's more likely that you don't have a union. And if that's the case, the first thing to do is talk to your coworkers. Talk about the things you don't have control over at work. What are the ways your job is being reduced to a set of actions or words or movements that you have no control over? And while you're at it, talk about other things. Your wages, your unpredictable schedule, your poor benefits, if you have benefits. I'm putting links to some resources in the description. I hope you'll take a look because a union, or even an unofficial group of your coworkers working together, is the only way to push back against de-skilling or anything else about your job that isn't working for you. On your own, you really can't do anything to protect yourself except switch jobs. And that's a gamble, since even if you can get a new job, you might just end up somewhere even worse. So if you're concerned about your job, whether it's de-skilling or anything else, a strong union is the only meaningful way to protect yourself and really to have any power at all over that part of your life. So go, organize,